China had successfully established itself as a major power. Finally, in 1964, the People's Republic also became a nuclear power. The first successful atomic test on Chinese soil took place at the experimental site in the Lop Nor Desert in the northwest of the country.
When the People's Republic was founded on October 1st, 1949, a new world power had emerged. And the Chinese resolutely added that if they were a world power, they also wanted an atom bomb. After the long conflict with Japan and also with the Americans, plus its separation from the Soviet Union, China was a nation at last. And as Mao indeed said, we are a nation which will never again be humiliated.
After the Soviet Union had refused to help China develop nuclear weapons, the People's Republic distanced itself more and more from its great brother and Russia's new leadership under Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin. An ice age began between China and Russia.
When Mao took a closer look at Soviet policy in the 1960s, he saw it by and large as a departure from the original ideals. The class struggle was being played down and a kind of peaceful competition between systems was being postulated, the idea that capitalism could be overcome in a peaceful way. By and large, Mao feared an end of the revolution and the implanting of bureaucratic, elitist mindsets within the party. This was something he had always tried to destabilize through mass campaigns. Now he sought out the cultural sector because basically it's the most open from an interpretational aspect. All kinds of things can be read into it. From late 1965, he used this weapon for his first open attacks on those he suspected of wanting to support revisionist efforts in China.
Mao looked for his new alliance partners outside the Soviet Union. In isolated Albania, he thought he had found a reliable ally against his Russian rival. When Albanian Prime Minister Mehmet Shehu visited Beijing in June 1966, Mao had already concluded his plans for a return to unlimited power in China. Now, he wanted to implement those plans. In July 1966, Mao reported back on the world stage with a massive publicity coup. To mark a swimming event across the Yangtze, China's biggest river, the 72-year-old went into the water himself. The idol of the People's Republic was preparing for his final campaign, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution.
The man was a master showman. Nobody's sure what's going to happen. Where is Mao? He disappeared for about 6 months. Not heard from, seen. The American press was reporting he's probably dead and they don't want to announce it, or very sick. And all of a sudden he appears on the front pages of every newspaper looking like life eternal in his bathing suit with a towel. He'd just flown the Yangtze. His hand up, saying hi to everybody. Hey folks, I'm here, and I'm in good shape, and I'm in charge. And then immediately he came back to Beijing and took charge.
Mao utilized the high esteem in which he was still held thanks to propaganda. Under the guise of staging an ideological line battle, he was planning a coup from the top. On July the 18th, the great chairman arrived unannounced at party headquarters in Beijing and let the great chaos begin.
Then he comes back to Beijing. He has a meeting of the political bureau in which he says, in our Constitution it's written, people have the right, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of organization, and so on. It says all the socialist countries have this written in their Constitution. Not one of them has ever carried it out. Don't you think it's time we carried it out? And for the first time, the contents of this meeting were leaked out to the people all over the place. So that was all they needed, really. He's back and he's overturning the whole show. He's bringing us freedom.
On wall newspapers, Mao announced everywhere that teachers and education politicians in particular were spreading bourgeois ideas. These wall newspapers at Beijing University called on students to combat these counter-revolutionary revisionists. On every street corner, flyers were distributed or slogans of Mao hung up. At bookshops in the university quarter, works by the great chairman sold like hotcakes. Rebellion is justified, he told the country's youth. Mao's stipulations were to replace the traditional code of values which had previously characterized Chinese society.
Initially, the Cultural Revolution was directed predominantly at the educational sector, at a reform of the school system and university teaching. It was in late 1966 that the first groups formed, more or less spontaneously. They called themselves the Red Guard. Then it was mainly the great mass movements of August 1966 which ensured that everything became a national phenomenon emanating from Beijing. School children and students nationwide joined forces and, in line with the tone of the time, formed units to destroy four old elements: old thinking, old culture, old morals and old customs. This found particular expression in Red August when, in various ways, so-called class enemies, be they teachers, children or the descendants of former class enemies, were then physically attacked and also beaten to death.
At battle sittings, as they were known, professors and party cadres were insulted and mistreated. Some had to wear pointed hats of shame. The Red Guards roamed the city looking specifically for delinquents named as such by Mao's staff. Soon the entire country was in the grip of his hysteria. The fanatical gangs didn't even stop at torture or manslaughter.
Many people felt terrified. For example, I remember a high school teacher. There came a knock on the door one night, and he opened the door and two of his students stabbed him to death. Right there. And so things like that happened. It was a time of terror. And the Red Guards called it Red Terror. They would form a circle around an official and threaten him. And if he was frightened, they would say that he's not a real revolutionary. He should not be afraid of the masses. If he wasn't frightened, they'd say this guy's okay. In fact, that was one of the tests they used to see whether officials, party officials, were real revolutionaries or not.
Anyone the Red Guards found to be unsuitable was lucky to escape with their lives. Many of the cadres who were removed from office were sent into the countryside to do labor service. The terror even drove some to commit suicide. All over China, police officials were ordered not to interfere with the young Red Guards as they went about their brutal business.
Red August was undoubtedly the phase when the terror had its greatest effect on the public, because that was when the social hierarchies were toppled. Schoolgirls simply kicked and beat a headmistress to death. Things like that, which were previously unthinkable, have ensured that they have an effect even today. But the majority of victims of the Cultural Revolution only occurred in the period from 1968 to 1970. And by then it was no longer a case of spontaneous violence by Red Guards, nor was it the result of conflicts between rebel organizations. Once again, it was mainly state campaigns designed to screen out and execute enemies.
In Harbin, in Manchuria, in northern China, press photographer Li Zhensheng saw how a crowd of spectators was assembled outside the city to witness the public execution of alleged counter-revolutionaries. No one intervened.
Es gab immer sehr schnell, sehr brutal.
In China, politics and interests were always brutally implemented very quickly. After all, that was one of the hallmarks of this society. China has a long tradition of engaging in conflicts through violence. It's a very brutal country, perhaps because of the experience that a human being is worthless. That's just the way it is. You die. You starve to death. You're washed away. You're killed in a political struggle.
Es ist eben so. Man stirbt, man verhungert, man wird weggespült, man wird in politischen Kämpfen getötet.
The Cultural Revolution, an important experience for human history. How do people behave when all the restrictions are off? How do different kinds of people behave when the police don't interfere and the army doesn't interfere, and you can do whatever you want?
Within the space of a few weeks, in Beijing alone, the Red Guards stormed more than 30,000 apartments, plundered and destroyed stores and possessions of all kinds. Residents and shop owners were often killed. Millions of Chinese destroyed their own books, paintings, and other works of art out of fear of making themselves look suspicious if they didn't. Even the city streets were renamed. The new address of the Soviet embassy, for instance, was Anti-Revisionist Street. Mao approved of such moves as being essential to the revolution.
He had formulated it into a theory that without destruction, there can be no construction. So if you want to build a really new society, first let them break everything down, destroy everything, overthrow everybody. And then they will begin to put things back together again.
2/3 of all historical monuments were destroyed. In the Summer Palace in northern Beijing, the Red Guards hurled sculptures from their bases and painted over historic murals. These were replaced with pictures of Mao, Mao's slogans, or propaganda posters. Showing foresight, however, their great chairman had the Forbidden City sealed off in order to protect the Imperial Palace complex from their random vandalism. In its destructive rage, the mob was driven not only by political fanaticism, but also by the satisfaction of carrying out totally personal revenge.
Had there not been any major social conflicts, this social dynamism could never have developed. But since only enemies were defined, and even then only vaguely, and since people were not given any really positive vision of a cultural revolution, various social groups were able to identify their problems in some form or other and try to implement improvements. It was therefore especially important for the children of the so-called class enemies to possibly have better access to universities, for applicants to be chosen no longer on just their social background, but also on performance.
Those who had been regarded as class enemies now tried to stand out through particular loyalty to the party line and hoped for rehabilitation. The terror destroyed all forms of social solidarity. Children denounced their parents. Neighbors betrayed one another. Friends handed one another in. Decades of indoctrination were having an effect. Mao had had Chinese youth educated in accordance with his wishes. Parents are the loveliest people in the world, but no one can compare with Chairman Mao, was a typical slogan. Even young children were trained with toy guns. Indoctrination of the people reached a new height. The words of the great Chairman Mao were everywhere, on rickshaws, on buses, even on bicycles. For easier use, something else also became part of the revolutionary routine of every Chinese: the Little Red Book, also known as the Mao Bible, presented Maoism in handy pocket format.
Es gab damals
There was this small collection of sayings by Mao, relatively simple sentences which were intended to show the essence of Mao Zedong's thoughts. They were arranged according to certain themes: army, people, youth, in order to introduce ordinary soldiers to Mao Zedong's thoughts, and probably also to teach them Chinese. You must remember that at this time, too, education of the people was really kick-started.
Die Alphabetisierung des Volkes erstmal richtig los und weiter.
Among the students in the Red Guards, the Little Red Book quickly became a cult object.
It was actually a product that wasn't thought up by Mao himself. It came about through chance and as a result of this political climate of ritualization of the study of Mao's writings. It had happened more or less accidentally, but it fitted in well with the time. In early 1966, the book was still banned. You couldn't buy one anywhere. So it was a product the young wanted because it was hard to get hold of. It also had a revolutionary style to it with this nice red cover and its handy format. It wasn't until the second half of 1966, in fact, that the book could be obtained in any form at all.
Soon, there was a copy of this Catechism of the 700 Million in every household. Here, too, the traditional social roles were reversed. Children instructed their parents in the meaning and importance of the revolutionary writings.
They would organize study campaigns at which people would read selections from his works. That was really the main way. Under the party's guidance, every factory, every government organization, every farm co-op would have study sessions where they studied extracts from his work. That, I think, was the main source of influence.
The Mao cult began to take on the appearance of a religious ritual. The words of Chairman Mao Zedong were learnt off by heart. At the start and end of each working day, workers bowed to a picture of the great chairman with the honorary title of the Red Sun. Even business letters began with quotes from Mao. Maoism permeated every level of society. Mao's messianic doctrine was to be spread to even the most remote province. Here, a group of young Red Guards are on their way to a remote village. They struggle to carry the equipment they've brought with them. The villagers welcomed the arrival of the young Red Guards because news rarely reaches this part of the world. What the group have brought is a mobile cinema. Then, almost as if he were present in person, Mao Zedong, the great chairman of the People's Republic of China, flickers across the screen. This is how many villagers saw their head of state for the first time.
Using different means and approaches, partly through direct contact but also partly through radio and TV reports, Mao had tried to generate the broadest possible effect of such events so as to disseminate the goals of the Cultural Revolution throughout the nation. He was quoted as having said that during Lenin's lifetime, too few people had actually seen the Russian leader, and that, as a result, revolutionary elan had cooled too quickly. So Mao tried once again to present himself as a revolutionary icon, to stir up the young revolution, and ultimately to use the leadership cult as a kind of charismatic mobilization against the party itself. In other words, no longer primarily via the Youth League or state media, but through this direct movement and a form of leader-allegiance relationship, basically to energize the revolution.
Mao decreed that every Chinese ought to visit Beijing once in their lifetime. On the anniversary of the founding of the Republic on October 1st, 1966, he had millions of young people from all over the country come to Beijing. Travel was free. Many of the youngsters had never even left their local region before. In the midst of these intimidatory masses, the obligatory Mao Bible gave them security.
Dieses rote Büchlein war so etwas wie ein politischer Ausweis damals.
At the time, this little red book was like a political pass.
Man ging nie ohne.
You never went anywhere without it. It showed you were of a certain political persuasion.
Und deswegen war das eben auch so ein.
So it was also a sign. When the first mass meetings took place on Tiananmen Square with the Red Guards, everybody waved their little book. So many young people who had come to the capital from the suburbs and the villages experienced it. The rallies were incredible. Newspapers reported on events as if Mao had appeared as a saint on Tiananmen Square.
In Zeitungen, als ob Mao auf diesem Tiananmen wie so eine Heiligenerscheinung ist.
Mao watched the masses as they marched past and found his power intoxicating.
Power does things to people, particularly because he was the overwhelming leader. And most of his colleagues, I think, were not able to criticize and control him. There was no real collective leadership. They talked about it, but he towered over the others. A decision that was adopted by the Central Committee of the party, he could veto. So in that kind of situation, I think a leader easily gets more and more full of pride and arrogant, and he doesn't think he needs to listen. Power corrupts. And by the time of the Cultural Revolution, he was already like a madman.
With the fanatical masses behind him, Mao had secured a following which obeyed him unconditionally.